Good afternoon. In this session, we are pleased and honored to welcome in Oris Stuart. Oris is EVP, Chief People and Inclusion Officer at the National Basketball Association. Originally from Philadelphia, in fact, he grew up on the same block as Will Smith, went down to Charlottesville, did an electrical engineering degree at UVA, jumped over to Durham, North Carolina for an MBA at Duke, worked for a variety of consultancies, including Deloitte and Korn Ferry, before landing with the NBA in 2015. Oris started out as EVP Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and got bumped up in the pandemic, got a broader portfolio last year to Chief People and Inclusion Officer. But great to see you, Oris. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Oris, thinking about your background, looking at dates, it seems to me that you were deciding to go to UVA and getting into UVA and attending UVA right at the peak of Ralph Sampson mania. Ralph Sampson was probably the greatest UVA basketball player of all time, NBA legend. Curious how that influenced your interest in basketball and the NBA at all?
Well, let me say it didn't necessarily influence my interest in basketball or the league. I grew up a basketball fan. I grew up loving the game, but it absolutely influenced my decision to go to Virginia. It was
Wow.
It was a great time for the school, and it was quite an attraction for me. I grew up across the street from a schoolyard, though, in West Philadelphia. So I grew up playing the game every chance I could get.
Lots of basketball. All right. Well, what about D&I? When did you first think about doing D&I for a living?
I am an accidental diversity and inclusion practitioner. I'll tell you, I started out, as you said, in electrical engineering, and I did some software programming earlier in my career, but I was introduced to this field and to this work almost by accident by a dear friend who was with a small consultancy. And when I was exposed to the promise of the work, the power of the work, this particular consultancy was doing it at a very strategic level, I was just fascinated and ultimately engaged in the work 20 plus years ago. And so I've been doing this since 2001, and have never looked back, because the work has such an important impact and a meaningful impact on how companies run their business, how they serve their customers, how they engage their employees, and so on. So it's been about 21 years.
I've heard you say that you've worked over your professional life with maybe 150, 200 organizations, and that you believe the NBA is second to none in D&I belief and activation. Second to none. That's a high bar. So tell us how you think about that. What do you mean by that?
Well, I would fashion it this way. The NBA thinks about this and cares about this topic in the context of everything we do across our league and across our business and our operations. And I know there are a lot of organizations that care deeply about this topic, that are very heavily invested in it. But when I think about our league and the fact that diversity and inclusion has implications on the fan experience in our arenas, on how we engage our employees and who we recruit, and how we develop and retain our employees, it has implications on our business partners and our entire supply chain, on our global footprint, and just everything we do in our business. We give some consideration, and we have some thoughts and some actions related to diversity and inclusion. And so I think it is so deeply embedded in our strategy, in our values, and in how we run our business that I've not been at a place where it's been more deeply integrated.
Okay. Does anybody ever say, Oris, you have it easy, man, working D&I at the NBA? You've got 75% of your public-facing employees are Black.
Have it easy? Well, people do make that comment. They say, with a league like yours, what is there to do from a diversity and inclusion standpoint? That's more often the comment or the question I get. But
right.
We've got a lot of work to do. The players on our court are certainly the customer facing and the public facing aspect of our league. But like I just said, we care about diversity and inclusion in all its implications in every aspect of our business and our operations. And so we've got work to do. And we're very committed to it, but we've got work to do across the board. And it's not that I have an easy job, but I do have a privileged job And I'll just add one more comment. The work of diversity and inclusion, certainly at the NBA, and I think in all places, it's not only about the head of diversity and inclusion, it's about all the business leaders, all of the team members, all the colleagues really being focused on this topic in their day-to-day activities. And so hopefully that's the focus we have at the league.
Well, Oris, digging into it, I know that the NBA is serious about this in many, many ways, and I'm curious where that seriousness comes from. What is the history of D&I at the NBA?
So I joined the league 5.5 years ago as the first chief diversity and inclusion officer, but we've got a long history of commitment to the topics of diversity and inclusion. I mean, it's so much a part of our culture and our value system, and there are examples, throughout our history of us being committed to social topics, to the values of fairness and equality, and to the broader topics of diversity and inclusion. So the official function started about 5.5 years ago, but the league's commitment, as it has shown up in so many different ways, goes back through the majority of our history, now 75 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've heard you talk about culture, and you're worried a lot about culture. It's not necessarily a policy here and there. It's also just the culture. How do you try to reinforce D&I considerations and that history in the NBA culture? How are you trying to shape that on a daily basis?
One has to, an organization has to have conversations about culture. It has to create expectations about culture and experiences that define the culture. And so one of the things that we've been doing over the last 5+ years is being very focused on learning around culture, in particular culture of building a culture of inclusion. And so we actually rolled out a series of trainings. The first one called Conscious Inclusion, which was focused on understanding unconscious bias and the implications of unconscious bias on how we make decisions about people, but just more broadly, how we make business decisions. We followed that up with an experience called Everyday Inclusion, which was focused on moving beyond awareness to understanding what are the behaviors and what are the expectations that we should have as colleagues and as leaders in terms of building that culture and demonstrating that in all of our everyday activities. And now we're in a process of having a conversation and an experience around practicing inclusion to really take it to another level and further define the elements of our culture that have to evolve and have to change, quite frankly, to make sure that our people are feeling connected to the organization, our people are being treated fairly and with respect, and that they're able to do their best work at the organization. And so how do you get there? You get there through conversations, through expectations, and creating common experiences about what the culture of the future, what your target and aspirational culture looks like.
Let's take a concrete development. I think one of the biggest developments in diversity in any industry in recent years has been the emergence of female assistant basketball coaches in the NBA. And so we see the headlines, we see Becky Hammond move into that position with the Spurs a few years ago. And I'm sure we don't understand the broader story of how that even happens. And that wasn't just Popovich elevating somebody. There has to be something the league was doing that created that ultimately. How would you explain the broader story? Because she's not the last, right? Now there are more. Now you've got female executives in front office positions. What is the broader story of how that is happening?
Well, it's about what we've been working on at the league, but I think more importantly, it's about the women themselves. These are women who love the game, know the game, have distinguished themselves over a period of time through their commitment to the game and their expertise. And so I think what we're talking about, certainly over the last several years, where women have increased in number in associate and assistant coaching ranks, as well as in front office roles, it's about their preparation and their dedication and commitment to the game, mapping up with a recognition of that commitment and opportunity. And so I'm thrilled to see what's happened, but there's a lot more, that we would expect, given the number of women who love the game and are preparing themselves for these kinds of roles. So I really do think it's about first the women putting themselves in a position, and then beyond that, it's about more and more teams recognizing, the unique gifts that they have. And I'll just make a final point. As I think about the challenge of a team wanting to get better, wanting to differentiate themselves, right? It's a recognition that these women have a unique life experience that they can bring in addition to their basketball expertise. And so it is a source of innovation in its pure sense, right? Having someone with a different background, a different experience, a different way of thinking about things in the game itself that allows them to bring that to the table, to the organization. We're always looking for that thing that can help differentiate us. And I think the increase in women is, again, a reflection of their contribution and preparation for the game, but also I think a recognition they have something very special, very unique to offer.
Well, having that many prepared candidates and giving credit to those candidates calls to mind the issue of a pipeline problem. And I know you're working in many different aspects of your business. What advice do you have to industries or to companies in industries where they have either real or perceived pipeline problems, not enough qualified candidates for the positions they'd like to hire them into?
It is all about where you're looking, and it's all about how you're thinking about where you're looking and how you're thinking about the process, more broadly. I'll tell you what, one of the things we did at the league is we took the entire recruiting funnel, the talent acquisition funnel that starts when you first decide you have a need in a particular role. And we took that funnel from the very top where you make that decision and you create a job description, and we dissected every single step of that all the way down to the point where you make the final selection. First of all, we recognize there is bias, or certainly the potential for bias, at every one of those steps. And then we identified what that bias is or what the potential is, and then we identified ways to interrupt it. And I'll just give you one quick example. When you create a job description, there's actually lots that you can do in how you define the job and how you word the description or how you express the description that could cause some individuals to select out or select into the process. And so, just creating an inclusive job description is a start for actually building a diverse pipeline to begin with. And then, where are you sourcing? Making sure you're not fishing in the same pond, that you're purposefully and intentionally looking for people in places that you might not have looked before. And that you're not only just casting a job posting, maybe even an ideally written job posting, but you're developing and nurturing those sources over time so that they understand your needs and you understand what they can offer. I mean, that's really how you resolve these pipeline issues. And, we have them ourselves and we're working on them every day, but you've got to go upstream, right? I mean, just think about what our gas and oil companies do, right? They look in lots of different places for sources, and then they develop those sources and they invest in those sources until they're actually, yielding. They're yielding the raw material, and that's the same thing we have to do with our talent. We have to open our aperture, open our minds, and kind of cast a wider net, and then make sure once they get in the process, we're not filtering them out because of our process. We're not filtering them out because of bias. It's not easy. It takes a lot of energy, but that's how you address a pipeline problem. And you also don't do it overnight. You don't say all of a sudden, I want some more of fill in the blank, and then you start calling some folks at a place you've never visited before and expecting them to serve you up a bunch of great candidates. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes sustained effort, and then you can break through.
What role do analytics play in this process, or more broadly in your efforts there at the NBA? You're an engineer by training. We're an analytics conference. We'd love to leverage data as much as possible. Have data been useful to you in your efforts there?
Well, the data that we looked at every stage of that recruiting cycle in terms of evaluating what parts of our pipeline are working and what parts aren't is really one example of how we are very focused on using data to get insight and to make better decisions. But, analytics and data more broadly are essential to understand where our opportunities are, where our weaknesses are, and then really to guide us into new strategies. And I like to think about data and analytics in a number of different, tiers. So most of us are counting things, right? And looking for outcome metrics, right? How many of these do you have relative to how many you could have or should have, or what the supply of these this profile looks like? But that's an outcome. That's a lagging indicator, quite frankly, of whether or not you're doing the right things to create the outcome. So I like to think about analytics and data in multiple tiers. So are we doing the right processes? And so evaluating the processes that we're supposed to be doing or should be doing or best practices and making sure we're checking off that and assessing that from an analytic standpoint. And then are we really living the right behaviors? Are we actually following the processes and doing the things that we know are going to lead to the results down the line? The outcome measures are essential, and at the end of the day, being able to say we were here in terms of representation of women in executive leadership roles. We know we could and should be in a better place, and now we're here. That's something we have to do. But then a fourth dimension is perception. What do people feel about the organization? How are they engaged? Do they feel like they belong? Do they have a sense of commitment to the organization that suggests that they're giving their best and doing their best work and that they are going to stick around for a while? So, process metrics, behavioral metrics, outcome metrics, and perception metrics, if we can evaluate how we're doing across all four of those dimensions, we'll have a pretty good picture of how we're doing and where we're headed and what we need to do to close any gaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oris, I've heard you talk, a theme, I think, in what I've heard you say before has been listening. I think many folks think of D&I programs as kind of imposed. Someone's decided that the companies to do it, and it's kind of imposed from above. When I hear you talk about what you do at the NBA, it feels like you're going around listening to suppliers, to fans, to employees. What role does that play in your strategy, and how different are your efforts because of that approach?
We have to meet people where they are, right? We have to understand our employees and what their expectations are, what their ambitions are, what their needs are. Same with our fans. And one of the reasons you pursue, and certainly we're pursuing diversity in terms of our internal representation of the diverse workforce and the diverse fan set we have, is because we want to have the ability inside our organization to have an ear for what those folks are saying outside of our organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the listening actually starts with having people who can understand what folks are saying, and not only what they're saying in terms of what they are directly communicating, but what they're saying through their actions or through their inactions. I mean, that's why you want to have diversity represented inside your organization. It reflects your customers or your fans, because you get insights because you understand the things that are said and unsaid. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that's really what it's about. But we also are very purposeful about asking our employees what are their perceptions about working at the organization, and are they going to stick around at a place like the NBA, and what do we need to do better? We're very, very focused on intentionally asking those questions, and we're asking the same of our other stakeholders, our business partners, our marketing partners, and of course our fans as well. So it's through those conversations, through the insight we gather, and then having the ability to interpret what we hear, that we can take real solid action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oris, last question for you. Somewhere there's a line manager out there or a staffer who's not in a D&I role, might even be from a historically privileged demographic, but wants to help, believes in the cause, and wants to play a supporting role in some way. What advice do you have for those folks and how they can help advance D&I cause?
Well, let me just challenge the notion that you just said. We're all in a D&I role. All right, maybe you don't formally have it in our title, but every one of us, regardless of our role as an individual contributor, and an example you just mentioned as a leader, you are necessarily in a D&I role, and you are either going to enable an inclusive culture, or you're going to get in the way of it. And so, what should you do? Well, we should all be driving for an inclusion instinct. What we want to have is an instinct for inclusion. I think what so many of us have is a diversity reflex. Something happens and we have this reflex that causes us to look at a situation through our filters, our filters of experience or bias. We need to have an ability to think about a situation, an individual, an opportunity, and think inclusively through that. And so What do? I'll give you three things. Number one, understand our own biases and triggers. We all have them, every one of us, because we're human. And so get a sense of what are the things that might be getting in the way of seeing people for who they are, seeing opportunities for what they are. Number two, really focus on building relationships across differences. We are very comfortable and have lots of ability to connect with people where we share some common interest or common characteristic, folks that we have a natural affinity with. You went to UVA, I went to UVA. We're best buds, you know. Automatically, you get a certain privilege just because of that. But what about folks that have other background, other experience? Understand and create a capacity to work with folks and connect with folks across differences. And how do you do that? Well, when you reach out across differences, when you start to understand your own biases, build connections with people where you have similarities, right? So it doesn't take much through a series of questions or engagements to find out what you have in common. We all have things in common in terms of common experiences, common outlooks, common interest. Find those things that you have in common with your colleagues, particularly your colleagues across different, and then it's so much easier to navigate the things that are different. And you then have more capacity, more agility, more dexterity to navigate all the things that we've got to do as leaders when we're dealing with people who didn't come up like we did or who have a very different kind of perspective or orientation to the world. So every leader, every individual, quite frankly, is part of this diversity and inclusion conversation. Whether you're engaged or not. And if you're not engaged, that's something that that's a different way and maybe not so positive way of you contributing to this topic as well.
Well, listen, appreciate the work you're doing. Appreciate the message you've provided here today. Appreciate the time you've taken. Love what you guys do there. We'll be watching you, Oris. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us about it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.